our plan is to talk about co-teaching in the content areas in the classroom and what those co-teaching practices look like for us as special education teachers, but also for regular education or general education teachers. So our idea is today that we're going to share with you some models of that, and so we're going to allow you to participate. What we're going to be asking you to do as we work through these models is if you've printed off your structured notes page, you have 3 questions that will frame what you were asking you to do while you watch the model of those videos. And the one is that you're going to look at what instructional strategies do you see occurring while we're talking about the instruction. The second thing is what is the general education teacher doing? And then the third thing is, what is the role of the special educator? So we're going to just take a look and give you some practice opportunity of that around that. And so we're going to begin with math, then we're going to look at that in reading, and then we're going to have an example for social studies. So we have one for elementary, middle, and high school grades. On the screen you'll see right now we're talking about co-teaching, and so these are the most familiar. We hear these and we talk about these co-teaching approaches. And so I'm just going to briefly talk about that. We have team teaching, and team teaching is when you have 2 teachers together. You'll see a representation of that today. We'll have parallel teaching. You'll also see an example of that today. You'll see station teaching, and that's where you have stations and each teacher is leading a station. And then we'll have alternative teaching example. And then we'll have one more that's one teach, one observe. The most frequently used and recommended by the research is parallel teaching, and that's when 2 teachers are teaching the same content, but they're delivering that content in 2 different ways. The station teaching is when that you have a teacher, a regular ed teacher, a special education teacher, both are leading a station and they're leading that instruction. And then you have an independent station. We think about that when we think about Mr. John O'Connor, who wrote Good Instruction, Great Achievement, because what he says is if you have 2 people in that classroom, both of those people should be responsible for leading and delivering instruction while they're in there. And so that's the good thing, is we think about how do we use co-teaching and how do we have co-teaching be effective in our classrooms. And it requires some planning, some organizing, and putting things together. But we hope that today you'll get to see some examples of each of those. So that's our plan for today. The next thing I'm going to ask you to do is we have, if you've got your structured notes page printed out, we're going to look at this next thing right here. So we're going to ask you, as we're transitioning, let's talk about what the roles and responsibilities are of co-teachers. So we're going to ask you to look through this list and look at the responsibility, and you decide, mark it on your structured notes page or just mark it on a post-it note if you have. But let's talk about what is the role of the general ed teacher, what is the role of the special education teacher, what opportunities are there shared responsibilities, and then what other times would we use paraeducators, volunteers. Let's think about our Save the Children folks. But so look at this list of responsibilities that we have in a classroom, and you decide if you think it's a general ed teacher, a special education teacher, or shared responsibility. And I'll give you 1 minute to look over that list. Okay, I know that maybe you didn't get through all the lists, but let's just look real quickly at the responsibility and roles of the general ed teacher and the special education teacher. So, introducing the partnership to the class. Let's think about that. Would that be a general ed teacher, you think, or would that be a special education teacher responsibility? What do you all think?
General ed.
Okay, it could be a general ed and they're introducing it to the classroom. Absolutely. It could be shared. Absolutely. Absolutely. What about planning the lesson? Who should be planning the lesson?
But shared with general ed.
Shared. So shared. Yeah, shared. Okay. So we do think shared because there's some responsibilities. We have to know what our role is as we plan those lessons. How about who identifies the needed accommodations for students? Who shares that information about student accommodations?
Special ed teacher.
Right. So the special ed teacher is going to have that expert knowledge about that. What about, so we have 2 questions, one around accommodations, but then one accommodations specifically for special education students. So that would be something we'd have to, look at that one, because our special ed teachers are the experts on the accommodations and supports for students.
You also have 504 students.
And whose responsibility is for that? And what Dean said is we also have those 504 students that are in those classrooms too. Right, and so that may be the general ed, but that would also be something that they may lean on the special education teacher's expertise to get some information for them. But preparing accommodated materials for all students, but then how about for special ed students?
With the special ed teacher.
You could be the special ed teacher for that. But how about preparing accommodated materials for all students? Sometimes, as general education teachers, we might not have all the ideas about how to accommodate. So sometimes we have to, that's a great opportunity for a partnership too, because special ed folks know partnerships on they know accommodations. General ed teachers know content, so it makes a great partnership when you have them having that conversation back and forth. And that's what you'll see today as we kind of model these, is that conversation back and forth. Because it doesn't take lots of time to plan lessons, but you do have to have some conversations. Also, we're looking at appropriate curricular modifications as determined by the IEP. Who would be doing that? It could be a special ed teacher, but do general ed teachers have access to IEPs and need to understand?
That's what I was gonna say, you have to access them to IEP so they can see the accommodations and all that as well.
Right, so it could be a shared responsibility. So the special ed teacher is going to make sure that we are getting those curricular modifications, but the general ed teacher is going to have to be responsible for planning those, because the special ed teacher might not be in there all the time, so they need to be aware of those. But they do have access to the IEP. Let's go ahead and, the next one is around differentiation. And who would be responsible for helping with instructional materials and differentiating instruction?
That could actually be shared.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the shared.
Yeah.
I think that's certainly something.
So I think I agree. And even whole group instruction, that's the next one. Who's responsible for that?
Shared.
Yeah.
It is shared, because if we know what the research says is that more effective instruction occurs when you have two highly qualified professionals sharing responsibility in the delivery of instruction. And you'll see an example of this. If Stephanie models a math lesson and she is the content expert in mathematics and I am not the content expert in mathematics, then I'm going to have to learn what role can I have to serve in that instruction, and how am I going to do that? Because I may have to learn some of that. I may have to go in there and learn some of that. I may have to learn how to do a skill or a strategy so I can share it with students, so I could lead a small group. And I may have to talk to Stephanie about that, or I may have to get some more information on that, because my expertise is not in mathematics. But that doesn't mean that I can't provide supports for students. I have to learn and adapt to that. So, but whole group instruction can be a shared responsibility. We're talking about instruction through station teaching, parallel teaching, and that one kind of gives you a cheat sheet on that, because it is a shared responsibility, right? It's going to take more than one person to be able to do those things. The other one is, looking at grading student work, looking at student work for special education. Those are responsibilities. Regular ed and special education teachers need to know what's happening with student performance and their targets and assessments and formative assessment. But special ed teachers have to know about student classroom performance, because they're progress monitoring their student performance, so they have to know that too. So.
It's also good when you go to write that present level to be able to compare to their peers. So it's good to have that information back there, is how is all students doing in the classroom compared to my student?
Right.
Is it taking him longer? That goes into that extended time too.
That's an excellent point. So how is my student performing in comparison of the other kids in that same grade? Are they significantly below, or what are they requiring? Much more extended time? Are they requiring more intensive intervention or especially designed instruction with strategies? Do they need smaller chunks, more repetition, additional practice time? So we think about all those things, but we have to be talking about that, because if we're not talking about it, we don't know the answer. So those are all important things to think about. So also things like about grading, that's important about student work, but conferencing we're talking about with all parents, and then parents with students with disabilities. So special ed teachers are working with teachers in conferences, particularly for students with disabilities, because if we're having a conference or an admissions and release committee meeting or an ARC meeting, we have to be having those conversations, and we have to have a general ed teacher by requirement to participate in those meetings, Therefore, we have to have those conversations with the general ed folks about what's happening. Classroom management is another one, and I'm kind of just skipping through them. And behavior plans. Well, you know, classroom management can be what? What do y'all think? Is that a shared? Is that a
I
particular?
think it's shared.
It's shared.
I think it's
Or
a
it needs
shared
to be
responsibility,
shared.
right? Because, and you'll see that today too. We'll have an example of that because the special education teacher can help support that through, you know, some of the co-teaching strategies about how we're tracking and recording behavior and how we're tracking and following what's happening on a student's behavior plan. So those were just some examples, but the idea is that we think about what the role is for general ed and special education teachers and how that most of those, we have a conversation, would you all agree, that are shared responsibilities, that we all have a something to contribute. So once I heard that we talk about a general ed teacher is the content specialist, but the special education teacher is the learning process specialist. And so when you put both of those together, that's a great force to be able to provide for students. And those students who are in the gap or those intervention kids get some incidental benefit from having that special ed teacher and that regular education teacher. So it really helps all the kids in the class. And you're going to see an example of that today, how we can even use those two people to provide an enrichment for those students who are advanced in that class. So we can use these strategies not just to remediate or catch up those special ed kids who are behind, but we can use this instructional strategies and these practices with co-teaching to really touch more kids more effectively.
Okay, so our next co-teaching model that we're going to talk about is station teaching. In this one, so what that's going to look like is that you have your general and your special education teacher is going to divide your content and your students. Each teacher is going to teach the content, and the one thing they would switch, and then they would just repeat that content or that lesson that they're doing at that station. One thing to keep in mind when you are doing station teaching is you can't teach something that needs to be in consequential order. So, for example, if you wanted to do like the vocabulary, which we're going to show, you can't just throw out a vocabulary piece at first without introducing it, because the person that's going to be at station one that's going to be determining main idea will not have any exposure to that vocabulary. So you want to make sure that you either front load at the beginning a whole group, which is what we're going to demonstrate, or that you do something that's not going to, it doesn't matter which order that you teach the content. Also, with that, so you could set up, you could have two teacher stations, and then if it's appropriate, you can have a station 3, which would be an independent station. In that independent station, this is something that the students can already do by themselves. This is where you would just do that reinforcement activity to so that they can practice the skill that has already been taught. One way that you can do that is to do a computer program that I know some districts have Moby Max, they have, and then you can do like reading rockets and things like that. Those are some good activities that you can do at independent station. You could also, if you were doing a story or a passage in your teacher station, then you can have a corresponding video about that same topic. They could watch that video in independent station, and then later as part of your next part of the lesson, then you can do that compare and contrast of different formats. So that would be a good idea for you to use for your independent station. But the one thing to remember is it's got to be something that they can do independently by themselves. It's already been taught. The good thing too about teacher station is that you can also cover a couple of your academic standards in one block of time. You can, so for example, like today, we're going to be, teacher one is going to be working on like some main idea and comprehension, and then the other one's going to be determining words and phrases. So that's two academic standards that you're going to hit in one lesson. We're going to talk through that, show you what that's going to look like, and then we'll just switch at the end. We're going to do, like the introduction of the lesson would be typically, in this case it's going to be, I'm going to be the general education teacher, Dion's going to be the special education teacher. And while we go through this lesson, this next part, this model, think about, on your structured notes, think about what strategies that we're using, what are the roles of the general ed teacher, what are the roles of the special education teacher, and
Instructional strategies.
the instructional strategies that are being used. So just kind of jot that down and record those as we go through them, and then we'll talk about them when we're finished. So at the beginning of the lesson, because I am a big fan of teaching vocabulary. Stephanie actually referenced vocabulary in math. It's just very, very important. So I want to front load that a little bit because I want to have a vocabulary station. So based on the model of Anita Archer, what you would typically do is we're going to, and as the role of the general ed teacher, I'm going to present the whole class. So I'm going to be presenting this lesson, but while I'm doing that, Dion, the special education teacher, she's going to be going around and assisting students that's going to have difficulty with that. And she's also going to be taking notes for our formative assessments later about what students are having a little bit of difficulty as we go through this lesson. So for example, okay, so now I'm going to switch into the actual teach mode and kind of show you what this is going to look like. Okay, class, we're going to go over a passage today, and we're going to go over 3 vocabulary words. Now, normally when you do this, you would do 3 to 5, but for today, just for the example, I'm just going to do 1 and take you through that. But you're going to repeat the process for the next 3, the other 2 words. So we're going to read a passage today, and we have 3 vocabulary words. The first word that we're going to talk about today is the word, not sure, can you see that? It's red. Is network. The word is network. Let's break that apart and let's make sure that you guys can pronounce it correctly. So we're going to break this down. Network. Network. The word is network. What is the word?
Network.
Network. Thank you.
If I wanted to sound that out, I might even do a syllabication for those kids who might need to do that as a kinesthetic activity. Network. Network. What is the word? Network.
So you're going to repeat that over and over, because if the kid cannot pronounce the word, they're never going to learn what it means. So you want to make sure that they can read the word and can pronounce it correctly. So what is the word? Network. Okay, then you give them a student-friendly definition. So a network is when lines are linked together to form a connection in order to share the same information. Okay? Now, when we talk about a network, then for example would be if 2 computers had linked to the same cables to share a printer. That is a network. And then another example of network is if your power lines on the power poles, we see these driving down the road, you see all of these lines connected. They are all connected to to transformers that links to other things. They're all connected. That is called a network. Good job. Now, think about the 2 examples that I gave you. The 2 computers, the power lines. You think of an example of what a network could be in 3, 2, 1. Can you give me an example of a network?
Like telephone wires connected together.
Yes, that is a network. Another example would be if you had, and this is kind of going on, progressing forward, we talk about lines, would be your internet. Now that is not necessarily, you may think it's wireless, and a lot of it is, you have the towers. However, when you go into your house and the guy comes in, he puts all the cables in, he puts the lines in for your internet, and they tie in your internet, your cable, and your phone in some cases, and that is called a network. They all are on the same network. And if one goes out, they all go out. That's what happens in my case anyway. So, and I want to give you just a couple more seconds, and I want to see if you guys can give me an example of what a network might look like. And as we're doing that, we're giving them some think time. Dion is going around and she is checking for their responses, and she's not doing any disrupting. She's just making smiley faces just to kind of let them know that what they are on the right track or whether they are not on the right track. So this is like what Dion had mentioned earlier about one of the models that is not necessarily effective used by itself, but we're incorporating it into the station teaching that we're going to fall into. So it makes it more effective like that. Okay, so then after you go that, you're check for students' understanding. At that point, then we would move on to the next word. And then you would do the same process that we just went through. But for our purposes today, we're going to move on to the next part. But just know that usually 3 to 5 words, depending on your students and depending on the text, that's what you would do for your vocabulary. Now, after we get through with that, then I would go through and just number the students. You can divide your groups. For today's purposes with our lesson, you're getting the same content, so you're not necessarily, it doesn't matter how you group the students. So I would just mark them off and just 1, 2, 1, 2. And then if I was utilizing the independent station, I would go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And after we numbered them, then I would say, okay, all the 1s go to station 1, all the 2s go to station 2, all the 3s go to station 3. And I do have station 3 labeled, but I do not have 1 and 2. But if I was in the classroom, I would have each table numbered so that they would know just to get up and go to that. So I would number them all. I'm not going to make these guys get up and move and just switch just because. But if we were in the classroom, that's what we would do.
And one more thing to think about is if we were in the classroom and we didn't want kids' movement, then Ms. Kraft and I could switch stations, right? We could move our station. Sometimes, thinking about right now and the mobility of kids moving around the classroom, like with COVID precautions, we can move as teachers, but also you may have a big room, and so we use this approach in a large high school classroom that had about 30 kids, and the physical movement of the big kids that were moving around the room was so disruptive that it was better that teachers moved the station. So that's another alternative to that.
It is, and also when you're in the elementary setting, because this is an elementary example, sometimes you have kids that they have difficulty with transition, say that they can sit and work, but if they get up and transition, then that kid, loses their attention and things like that. So that would be another reason why you would want to do the teachers instead of the students too. So you got to know your kids and do what's best for your classroom. Okay, so now we're into our stations. So on station 1, what I am going to do is I am going to, the reading target that we would address in this station is ask and answer questions like who, what, when, where, and why, and then we're going to support those inferences with the details is what we're going to do. And while we do that, I want to really briefly, I want to mention, I think, I love this book. I throw it in anything I could get into. You guys should have this in your materials. And this is the strategy that we're going to cover today. And I want to really quickly, before we go into the station, is to talk about this book because, again, like I mentioned this morning about when I give you something, and and it's you don't have to read this from front to back either. It is, when you go to the table of contents, the goals are listed if it's fiction or nonfiction, and what skill that you want to teach for that day. So on ours, what we're going to be looking at is a non-fiction text, and we're supporting comprehension and nonfiction, and we're determining key details for that. And what's really cool, and every chapter is the same, but I want to show you this page right here. I love it. It tells you the strategy, it tells you the grade levels. They are lettered instead of numbered as far as a grade level, but there's a chart in the back, but like A is equivalent to kindergarten and so forth. So it tells you what level it's good for. It tells you the genre that it would fit for, and then the skill. And these skills on the side match the comprehension strategies, the monitoring for meaning, the questioning, visualizing, those 7 thinking strategies that we have to teach that goes into our comprehension goal in order to increase student comprehension. These are all listed here. So if you know you want to target one of those specific thinking strategies, you can just come over here, and which is what I do when I know what I want to teach, and I start on this side and see what lessons that what strategies I can do. Okay, so when I get over here to my lesson, and I would you know, again, you could usually sit down with your kids if you want to, or stand. I've done both, so it just depends on your setting in your classroom. So I'm gonna have and let me know too that when we do this, for today's purposes, we're doing it one at a time, because we want you to be able to see this one and then be able to see Dion do station 2. If you're in the classroom, this is going to be going on at the exact same time. So when you get your station, when you get your kids settled at the table, you're going to set your timer. That timer is going to be predetermined because you, the special ed teacher and the general ed teacher, have already planned this out ahead of time. We know how long our stations are going to last. So we're going to set that timer and begin our lesson. And then when the timer goes off, we will switch and then just repeat that same lesson. So, but for right now, we're just going to do one at a time so that you'll be able to see both of them. So what I would do first is I will introduce my lesson. Okay, so today we're going to read about telephones now and then. The first time, and we're going to do a strategy called it's a close reading. And what I would do is first you're going to set the stage. So you're going to tell the kids the purpose. So our purpose today is we're going to identify the main topic, and then we're going to try to find some details that's going to support that topic. If it was, a fiction text, you could say main idea. With nonfiction, usually it's more of a topic that you're going to talk about. So before we get into this, we want to think about using our context clues. So in this particular reading passage, we have a picture, and then we have the title, which is Telephones Now and Then, and then we have a picture of a telephone. It's a rotary phone that's on the wall. So before we get into the reading, I want to ask them let's make some predictions using the context clues about what you think this passage will be about.
How telephones have changed over the years.
So how phones have changed over time, okay? And what made you have that prediction?
Just the now and then, telephones now,
So she used the words now and then. And then, of course, the picture that we have here is a rotary phone, which is obviously an old one. So that's a picture from a long time ago. And then we know that our phones don't look like that now. So that's a very good prediction. So you talk that through, and then when they have the prediction and you have them explain where they got that prediction from. And it makes them have that deeper thinking for themselves. So after you do the pre-reading, then you're going to read. You could do a first read, we call it. The first time you would read it all together, and this is just to help with the fluency. So we're going to read it together for fluency. Telephones help people speak to one another when they are apart. For more than 100 years, nearly every telephone. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but that's what you would do. You would read it through. Now, if you have students who struggle with grade level text, and you will, and they may hit words that they know and the words that they don't know, that is perfectly fine. And sometimes what I've done in my station is I don't read it together the first time, I read it to them the first time. So it just depends on your students and where they are. If you have mixed groupings, then the students that's going to know it can read it with you. The students who don't, they can follow along. And that's perfectly fine, because the point is for them to get familiar, hear the words the first time in their text, and so that they can be familiar with them. At least they've heard it at least one time before. So you read all the way through. And then you can determine, again, like I said, if you want to do it by yourself or read it with them. If you read it by yourself first, I would read it one more time to see if the kids would want to do it the second time through. Then, after you read it straight through, then you want to read it again, but this time you want to have more of a focus. You want to have them look for key terms, and with that, you would tell them with the text features, like if it's a bold print or if it's italicized, or if a word repeats. For example, in this one, we didn't read through it, but you guys have copies, like the word landline is a word that repeats a couple times. So that might be something worth looking at, and that might be important. So you want to, and they may be different for each person, and that's okay. Because as you read it, and I would take it paragraph by paragraph, and I would pause. You read it a little bit slow, you read it together, and then if there's key words, they mark it, and then you kind of take a pause at the end of each paragraph and let them underline what they think might be important and get those key words. If there's any dates or names when we're talking about a nonfiction text, if there's anything in those, that would be probably, names and dates are usually important in nonfiction, so you can probably front load that if you need to and give them that little clue before they start. Because you're going to have some students, sometimes if you tell them to underline stuff, they're going to underline the whole paragraph. So you want to really be specific on, let them look for dates, let them look for names, something that repeats, things like that. After you go through that, then your third read is going to be an independent read. They're going to read it by themselves. This is where this strategy comes in from the book, the wonderful book that I absolutely love. And it is on page 257. If you happen to have it with you and you want to follow along, that is fine. If not, that is also fine. You just know that you do have it. So this one is called Read, Cover, Remember, and Retell. So basically what it is you can give them a Post-it or their hand. I would prefer a Post-it just because hands are different size, and it moves and things like that. So just give them a Post-it. So I'm going to give you a Post-it, and I'm going to give you a Post-it. And you're going to cover up a piece of the text. So you're leave the first sentence open, and then you're going to cover up a piece of the text. And I know it's a square, so it doesn't really. You probably want to get like an index card or something that's more rectangle instead of a square, because if you're reading left to right, it makes it a little difficult. But the point is that you cover what you're not reading at the time, and then you read. So we're going to look at the first sentence, and it says, telephones help people speak to one another when they are apart. And then I have my Post-it covered the rest. So I'm going to, after I read that, I'm going to take my Post-it and then I'm going to cover it up. And then I'm going to think about what I just read, and then I'm going to repeat that back. Now, if you're reading it independently and everybody's doing that at your station, you don't have to be verbal. You can be quiet and think that through and just jot it down on your paper. If you have students who reach that frustration level trying to write down what they think, or they get hung up on how to spell words, then you can have them just whisper it quietly to you, or just have them at first just think it to themselves of what it is, and then they will have a chance to share out at the end. After they read the sentence, cover it, think about it, what did I just read, and then they're going to have to be able to retell that. I would repeat that process, then I would lift up my Post-it, and then I would read the next. And it depends on the side. It depends on the level of your students. So for today, we could read a paragraph at a time. These passages are a little short, so we could do a paragraph at a time and then have them cover the bottom. And then they could read the whole paragraph and then think about what they read. And then they can lift, and then they cover it. think about it. And remind them too, because sometimes if they read it one time and then they cover it up, and then they're gonna panic because they can't remember and then it's covered up. So just remind them that it's okay, they can peek. If they can't remember it, they can peek at it to get some reminders for them. Because at first they're gonna have to, because they've not practiced that. But the more they do that, a lot of times, maybe the first time they'll have to peek a couple times, but once they realize that they've practiced how to do it, and then they can focus in, then the farther they get down the passage, they'll be able to retell that and at least explain it better. Another thing too, as they're reading through, another close reading strategy is if they come across something when they're reading independently and there's a word that they don't know how to pronounce, then they can jot that down on the side. And this is good too sometimes when you can give them a passage in paper instead of in a textbook, because they can write and mark it up if they need. And sometimes if you don't have a lot of copies, you can put it in like those little sleeves, and you can use dry erase marker if you need to. But they can write words on the side, or even on a separate sheet of paper. If there's a word that they don't know, they can work on the side. And then as they read a sentence, if they get to a point when they cover it up, so if I said telephones helps people speak to one another when they're apart, if I cover it up and I think speak to people when they're apart, I don't really understand what that means. So that helps them recognize that they don't really understand that, and then they can just maybe put a question mark beside of that sentence, and then they know that when they get finished, then that's a question that they can ask the teacher. Or ask the teacher when you're sitting at the table and you look around and you see that they write the question mark, you know that that's something that you can address. You can address it as a whole, as your small group, or just with that one student, and help them talk through to understand what that means. Okay, I'm going to pause for just a second because I've talked a lot without really taking a breath. Do we have any questions so far about the closed reading process or anything up to this point? Okay. Also in this book, it gives you some prompts to help with the students if you, to help guide them in their thinking. But basically it's just to ease their, the anxiety level raises sometimes when they think that they can't look at it. So just encourage them that it's okay if they want to look at it again. And then at the end, when they know, because I know as an adult, I will read something and I will read every single word. But as we all know, sometimes you've got something else thinking on your mind and this and that. And then if somebody asks me something about it, I can tell you one thing I just read, and I know I read it. But with this strategy, we have found, because if they know ahead of time that they're not going to be able to look at it, they're going to have to think about it, process it, and retell it back to you, then it raises that level of focus and attention, and they concentrate a little bit more. Because sometimes it's not necessarily that they're not capable of doing it, they just don't focus and concentrate enough on, they read it to get it through. Okay, so you would talk through that, and then at the end, after you get through, and a couple, at the first when you start this strategy, you would have to really sit down and do it together. Okay, let's read, and everybody would really be on the same section, probably. You would go through and do that, and then, and even if you could probably, and again, it depends on your kids. I've seen it done both ways. I've done it both ways. You can start out the couple paragraphs together, and then once they get the hang of it, then there's like, okay, I can do this, and then they'll want to take off and continue themselves, and that is fine, because that's ultimately you want them to do that by themselves, because it's the independent read. And then if you're going to have students in that group that needs help all the way through, and that is also fine. And then what you may want to do when you determine your station, your groups for stations tomorrow, the ones that did it independently, then you can do it you can do your groups different the next time. It just all depends. Okay, so that will be station 1. At the same exact time, Dion would be in station 2. Would be doing the vocabulary. Now remember, I front-loaded the 3 at the beginning. It was really, really quick. It was just a quick introduction. And some of those kids, that's all that they would need. The examples we talked about, they get what a network is, they're ready to go. But there's going to be some kids in that classroom that they're going to need that extra. So again, we're going to use a Freyer model. Stephanie said she liked it for the math vocabulary. I love it for vocabulary. I think it's a good visual, that graphic organizer. I really like it, and it's been effective for students. So she is going to go through each of the vocabulary words again and provide how to go through that Freyer model and go through that. So she would be taking over on the vocabulary and doing it at the same time.
Okay, all right, so we'll go through this and I'll talk about that and then, yeah. And so station 2, so this may be station 1, so station 2, I'm gonna take my mask off so y'all can hear me, I'm sorry. So station 2, we're gonna be working on that vocabulary. And so we know how important that is for instructional strategy for working with students, especially our struggling students, but all students would benefit from vocabulary. So I'm going to use that same approach we did before. So we've already taught this and we already learned how to do this. But we have a couple more words that have been identified in that text that would be words that would be difficult for students to be able to use. So for this particular model for our vocabulary lesson, we're going to use the word process. So let's all write the word process. Okay, so let's talk about the word process. So process, how many syllables is in that word process? Let's think about it. Process. Process. Okay, so we have 2 syllables, right? So what is process? So what do we know about the word process? What is that, and what do we know about process?
Is it how you do something?
Right, it's how you do something, right? It would be how you do something. So we could even write that one in our definition. Okay, so if we have the word process, what would be some characteristics of that word?
It could be a noun or a verb.
Could be a noun or a verb. Excellent. What else do we know about that word? Any other characteristics?
Maybe it has steps.
Steps.
Would it be appropriate to say you broke the word down here? There's a prefix pro.
Absolutely. Okay, so those kids who don't have word attack skills, that don't read very well, they need word attack skills, right? But that would be a strategy we'd use. We didn't talk about pro. What does it mean for pro? What do we know that pro means?
Go forward, or is that like a prefix? Proceed?
So that's another word we could use. So
Move.
pro, move. Yep, right. It would be move. Okay. So it sounds like we're moving. Okay. So there's like a clue that we find in this word that helps us figure out what this word might be, right? So we already know some things that gives us a clue because we know some other words that are similar to that word that it gives us a hint that helps us figure out how to solve what this word is, to figure this word out when we come across it and we read it. Let's talk about what is an example then of a process. What would be an example of that? Because we're saying it's something, it's how you do something, it's steps or move. What might be that process?
Baking a cake.
Yep. Okay. What else might that be? Can you think of another example?
Well, this morning we talked about developing an IEP. That's a process. Yeah.
So an IEP, okay, that is a process. It is a process. But what is it not? Sometimes it's hard thinking what a word is, what it's not, right? Because that's hard to think. What is a process is not?
It's not one thing, it's not one action or
Right. Not one action, it's not one action. How else could we help us to think about what that word is? What is a one-step thing that we do?
So, it could be just what we've been working on here, it could be, we could just read. You just do that, you just read.
Just read.
You just
okay?
read, so you're just,
Just
you know,
one?
that's just one thing.
Just read one thing,
There's
right?
no, yeah, there's no process in that, there's no steps, you're just,
You just do one action.
that's one action. Yeah.
Okay.
For the look,
Or to look.
Look,
Yeah. Okay, so those are examples. So what might we have as an image that would help us remember what the word process is? We're saying it's steps. Could we draw some steps? What does it look like to
Number
look?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah, you could have it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You could number it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I relate everything
or arrow.
to basketball, and I think about the big process, Joel Embiid, and what they're referring to is it taking a long, there's many steps for him to get to
Uh-huh.
being the player that he can be.
Right? So it could even be something like a moving
A
up.
progression.
Progression.
Mhm.
So any of these might help us remember what the word is, process. So when we come across that word process, we have some things that we know about that word now. We know that it has a prefix that helps us solve what that problem is, but we also have a mental image of what that looks like. Now, you'll take your graphic organizer and you'll put that in your vocabulary notebook. So as we read, and when you get to Independence Station, if you need to remember what this word is or how to use this word, then you can pull your vocabulary notebook back out and look at your vocabulary, because we have a clue that gives us an idea of what that means. We remember it's a step, it's a process, is what our word is. Baking a cake, writing an IEP, but that's how we're going to use that word. And so that's what this vocabulary station is going to look like. So as Chas explained with the reading comprehension, so you see this is all working simultaneously again. So, but I would be leading this station. My responsibility as a special ed teacher would be to facilitate that instruction. I could do the main idea, or I could do the vocabulary. It doesn't matter which one of those stations that I lead. Maybe I'm much better at facilitating the vocabulary, or maybe I'm better at main idea. Like I might be better at copy and cover at strategy, or I might be better at close reading strategy. So I would, we would decide what we would do. Now these kids over here at Independence Station might be working on, just like she said, we're reading about telephones. And so they maybe are watching a video about the introduction of telephone the telephone, the introduction of telephones. So that we're building that background knowledge, right? But we're building all that contextual, because those are all instructional strategies for reading comprehension. So that's how we get kids to be able to read that grade level text and have access to that grade level text. So we introduced a few things on the front end of it with some vocabulary to get them started. Some kids may not need that as much, so I'm going to change my groups. So let's say that this was a group that needed some more scaffolding. Well, if this group they were a little more advanced, they could already give me some sentences using the word process in the context, right? They could show me that they knew how to use that word process, and they could write 3 sentences using that word correctly. And that would be an example of how that could look at that vocabulary. So, or they could write using those vocabulary words, they could write a summary of the article, right? So I could extend that vocabulary based on what the student need is. But the idea is that when we use a station teaching, that we use 2 teachers. And look again, it significantly reduces the teacher-student ratio, and it puts it back smaller groups. So I can personalize. So if Ms. Kim is making an error on her word, or she's struggling with prefixes and suffixes, then I know that maybe tomorrow, then I might have to do a little mini lesson on prefixes and suffixes. Or we might have to break down that word today on what pro means as a prefix, right? But again, I can do that immediately, and I can give immediate corrective feedback right then. And same thing with what you guys are doing in the teacher station. So let's say 20 minutes is up and the bell goes off because we've got a timer, because we have to be real explicit and we got a timer running. So when that timer goes off, we get up and switch, right? So you guys come and do vocabulary, you guys go do comprehension, and then the independent station maybe moves here. So we're always rotating. But the research suggests that when you start with station teaching, that you begin with those 3 stations. You begin with 2 teacher stations and the independent station. Always remember that the independent station would be one that kids can do independently. They don't need a lot of your support. It could be watching the video, or it could be an extension of something that you've already taught, because you want them to be able to work on their own while you really target that group. And so you can use station teaching. If you have a target group of kids that you really need to see every day, you can use that station teaching for the last so many minutes of your class, and you can try to pull that group more intensely. Some of the kids that don't need us as much, maybe we only pull them once or twice a week. Or that medium group, we maybe pull them a couple times, but then we make time for every day that that one small group gets pulled back to that station. That's how we can make that happen. That's how we can do RTI in the classroom, right? That's how we can work together to provide specially designed instruction, but also get kids access to content level standards. We give them those scaffolds. So I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to let you guys look at your notes that you took on what we've done around the instructional strategies. I'm going to give you about a 2-minute think time, and I'm going to let you write down what instructional strategies that you saw either that Chastity used or that I used that would be strategies that you found would be effective, and then what was the regular ed teacher doing, what was the special ed teacher doing, and take about 2 minutes. All right, so I hope that you took just a few minutes to think about what instructional strategies you were able to identify as we were going through that model, that lesson. So I'm going to ask those of you that are participating virtually to just, firstly, let's go through that first question. What instructional strategies did you observe during those co-teaching practices? So chat, folks, if you're in virtual, jump right in there and throw those in there, and then we're going to let the folks in person talk about what they found. So you guys, anybody want to start us off? What instructional strategies?
Chastity used predicting, what we're going to be reading about in the title.
So Chastity used predicting,
Chunking, she broke down the reading sections into smaller sections.
chunking,
Summarizing, that was covered up part of the text and then summarize what they read.
summarizing,
And then you use graphical organizers.
and the use of graphic organizers. Are all of those SDI? They all are specially designed instruction for our students. All right. How about you? Do you have something you want to share?
I just remember then, like, pre-teach, the network thing you got to do today, and that's something different.
Okay. So pre-teaching, absolutely, because so she pre-taught the vocabulary. Excellent. Kim or Danny, Paul, do you all have anything you want to add to what we talked about our instructional strategies?
I like the way the front-loading vocabulary.
Mhm.
I just really felt like that was helpful, and it's really helpful for students with disabilities because they have reading issues most of the time, and so doing that is huge for understanding and checking for understanding.
I just love the reinforcement of vocabulary. I mean, coming back to that again, meaning that you didn't just front load it, but you came back to it again and that kind of thing was wrong for me.
But again, most of the time, that's a strategy we need to use for our students with disabilities, that front loading that vocabulary, but building that vocabulary. There's usually, there's oftentimes a deficit. So in the chat, I don't see anybody in the virtual world out there. How about some of you that are participating virtually? We don't want to leave you not engaged in this conversation. So what instructional strategies did you see? Stephanie says, front-loading vocabulary and graphic organizers. Excellent. Graphic organizers, Tracy? Yes. Okay, well, thanks for those of you who are hanging in there with us and sharing your responses. So what was the role of the special ed teacher? That was me, yeah, for this month. Right, so I was teaching and facilitating the vocabulary lesson from beginning to end, the whole time I'm teaching. All right, what about the general ed teacher?
Reading comprehension.
So she was working on the reading comprehension. So the point of it is station teaching, so we were kind of team teaching, but actually I was just assisting at the beginning. Now that only lasted for just a few minutes, right? Because I was checking the vocabulary. So I could say, okay, from our class, 8 out of the 10 kids that were using that vocabulary strategy could use that vocabulary word, right? Or I could tell her how many students. I could adjust my centers based on that. Right then I could adjust my station. So if I saw a student that had no idea, or could not use a word attack strategy, and I needed to build that before I introduced them to the text, I could move them very fluidly to this other station. I wouldn't have to just say, you're going to this station all the time. I move you real quick. or if you've got the vocabulary, and I can move you around, right? So that allows me as the teacher opportunity to do that. But I would be working, with my partner, trying to figure out what we could do to best serve those students. So we're moving kids in and out. So I don't know if we have just a couple more slides here, but we're going to go on then. Do we have any more, Tanner, before I jump? So what? Graphic organizers. So, but the thing about that is, and let's make a point about that, because there may be people that are just joining or are new to special education. When we go in that IEP and we talk about specially designed instruction, and we find this drop-down menu that has all of these things in there around specially designed instruction, and we click the use of graphic organizers, do we really know what that means, right? Do we really know what that means to use a graphic organizer? So all kinds of things can be used for a graphic organizer. A structured notes page is an organizer. A Freyer model is an organizer. So when we say that, and that's what we're going to do for students, that's what we mean when we use those terms, graphic organizer. And that's how we use that for specially designed instruction. And those of you that's been doing it a long time, sometimes you'll even, that you've been using these strategies, you just didn't know that's what we were calling. But if we all use that same language and we know then what support students do well with or what they excel. I had a student, for example, that if I gave him an organizer or a way to kind of frame his work, had a child with other health impairments, so he had ADHD trouble, and he would have so much trouble concentrating and focusing. But if he could just put small chunks and organize those, then he could take those small pieces and put them into a text or a response that was organized. So he just needed that, right? But again, that's how we use those strategies. And that's why co-teaching is so effective, is we can figure out how to use those to make it better for students.